All right. Crystal said, all I ever hear is the need for a surplus to gain muscle and a deficit to lose fat. Can I achieve both at the same time? We'll be diving into this and so much more. I think this question comes up a lot. I'd say it's probably one of the most frequently asked questions, like when it comes to people just wanting to lose body fat or gain muscle or tone up or however they word it. Um, so I think this will be and honestly, Joelle said before we started, every one of these questions you guys asked today could be its own podcast. So we probably will cycle back to some of these topics and elaborate more.
These were great questions. I don't know why they don't like answering your
You
questions.
guys, you never answer when I post in the Facebook group. I got like crickets the other
I
day.
appreciate the love though, for sure.
That's
I
fine.
would also like to say the questions asked in the Facebook group are infinitely better than the questions asked on Instagram. Maybe because there's
Yeah.
no character limit too. But
That
like
I
my
think is a
Q&A
big
box
thing.
never looks that good.
Well,
Yeah.
this is also our community already. Like they've been here, they
True.
know what we're about. So it's like very awesomeness
I
in
do
regards
think
to the
the
questions.
Q&A box limits a lot of people though, because like a lot of these are very long, and I
Yeah.
know that they would not be possible in the Q&A
Well, they give
box.
like background on the question
Yeah,
and gives
which
you more
is great. We
context.
love
Yeah,
that. So
people are able to provide, I think, a lot more context.
yeah. So let's dive into this first one. Who wants to kick it off?
I think it's
Maintenance,
just
baby.
it's like those when you talk about surplus, you talk about deficit, like those are the two basic staples from which everything else branches out. And then from that point is where everyone starts to try to make it sexier and tries to make it more complicated than it needs to be. So there's a ton of volume in regards to information as far as like what's the best way to bulk, what's the best way to cut. But like at its simplest form, it's being in a slight surplus or being in a slight deficit and being consistent and riding that out for a very long period of time. So to kind of simplify, like that's it. Like there's no other layer to it. Now there's 1,000 ways you can do that, but in its simplest form, that's it.
Well, Joel, you just said maintenance, and we put up an awesome post on the Levolution Instagram yesterday, was it? That was Coach Tori's client that
Yeah.
showed like their DEXA results. So talk about that for a second.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna just bring up because I understand what you're saying, Josh, about like you're either in a slight deficit or you're in um a slight surplus, but I do think that there's a middle ground. And I think that maintenance is a really, really important place for most people to be. And I think that people hear the word maintenance and they're like, maintain? Like, no, I don't want to maintain where I'm currently at. And I think most people don't realize, especially if you're more so a beginner. Like, I know when I first got into health and fitness, it was like cutting, bulking, cutting, bulking, cutting, bulking. And you were like, when does this end? Like, do I ever just get to like live? And that's what I feel maintenance is. That's what I think most people should be living in. And there's a few different points to make about maintenance. So, to your point, first, Alessandra, we made this post the other day. Coach Tori had this client who did a DEXA scan, and DEXA scans are essentially the gold standard of body composition testing. This is not the same thing as like an in-body scan or like a body weight scale that measures your body composition. DEXA scans are used to assess body composition, but also the main reason that they're used is for bone density scoring to see how someone's bone density is. And this was really cool because obviously we have clients who occasionally get labs and things like that, but we don't require it, right? There's no like baseline labs you have to get. And so this client in particular had done a baseline DEXA scan, which is super cool. And then 3 months into her coaching, she did another DEXA scan and she had gained muscle. She had lost body fat. The DEXA scan also tells you like where that body fat is coming from. So it showed that she lost visceral fat, which is like the fat surrounding our stomach and organs and things like that. And um and her bone density improved. Now that was in 3 months. And you'd imagine that the top question when you see all of that progress, right, in 3 months, the number one question is, well, what was she eating like? What was she training like? What was she doing? And it's like, you know where she was? She was at maintenance. She was eating maintenance calories. She was not in this extreme deficit or this extreme surplus. She wasn't in this bulking phase or this heavy dieting phase. She was at maintenance. And I just think that there's a lot of progress that can be made at maintenance. And I think that people do overcomplicate needing to be in one place or another. Now, granted, if you are someone who is considered overweight or obese and you have been advised to lose weight or you want to lose weight, I'm not telling you shouldn't do that. If you have 50 pounds to lose, that's not going to happen at maintenance. So we can absolutely make that clear. But when we're talking about standard body composition improvements, which honestly I would say is like the average person that comes to us for coaching is someone who like wants to improve their overall health, would like to improve their body composition. It's usually not, I'm coming to Levolution because I have 200 pounds to lose. Like it's usually something closer to lifestyle. And obviously we've had, weight loss clients who are down 100 pounds plus. But my point is when we are closer to maintenance, there's still a lot of progress that can be made. And that DEXA scan result was a really great example of that.
So
Yeah.
I don't disagree with that at all. And we actually, if it was either on an earlier podcast or I did a YouTube on it, I am a huge proponent of gaintaining. If you're trying to build muscle, improve body composition through phase of maintenance, and even slight, we're at maintenance, but we're focusing on losing some body fat. You can do some incredible things because it's something you can do for a long period of time. So we've talked about if we're doing this maintenance phase for body composition improvements for the general population, then we're really digging into things like improving progressive overload in our training. So making sure we're getting the most out of that. We're seeing progressive overload while we're eating at this specific caloric threshold. I was just kind of oversimplifying the case of, all I hear about is cutting and bulking. And this is, what are the nuances in between? It's really kind of cut and dry when it comes to that. But 1,000% agree with everything you just said. And it's something where most, maybe I don't say most because most of the country is technically overweight and obese, but most of our general clientele is in that range where we've seen how many times a complete transformation within 3 to 5 pounds because they weren't focusing on this extreme cut or this extreme bulk. It was just long-term consistency with a protocol they could dig into.
Or slash and maybe they come to Levolution with a higher weight loss goal, but our goal as the coaches is to get them to a maintenance point. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like we want to get you to a point where you're not dieting for the rest of your life. We want to get you to a point where you have built muscle, you have lost body fat, you're feeling strong in the gym, you're feeling great, and now you can maintain what you're currently doing. And so, again, I just don't want people to equate maintenance phases with like complacency or maintaining your body composition because there is so much progress, whether it's strength, performance, overall health, and body composition that can be made at maintenance. And just the last one quick point that I want to make about maintenance, because I think this is something that people get confused about. Maintenance is not one specific number. It is a
Mm-hmm.
range of numbers. And I think that's really important for people to remember, which is why in, let's say, a maintenance phase, you have a little bit more leniency in terms of tracking and caloric intake. And so an example of that in practicality might be, I maintain my body weight anywhere from eating 2,200 calories a day to 2,600 calories a day. Once I start to go below, above 2,600, I start to gain weight. Once I start to go below 2,200, maybe I lose weight. But in that range, I maintain. And so I think that's another thing for just people to keep in mind in maintenance.
Yeah, no, I think that was probably a light bulb moment for a lot of people listening. And I love that you gave an example because that's a 400-calorie difference. And a lot of people would look at that and be like, whoa, like especially women, like who are usually come to us under eating and
Right.
eating very low calorie. I think that's so important. But along with your point there, Joelle, your maintenance body weight is also a range. Like you're not going to be the exact same weight on the scale in maintenance every single day. That's
Yeah.
going to fluctuate and there's a range there too. So understand it's a sliding spectrum and some days it might be higher, some days it might be lower, but ultimately you're in that range of maintaining.
You also
Yep.
brought up a good point as far as like these cycles of cutting and bulking, cutting and bulking, cutting and bulking. And I was on that ride for like a decade. Like I think a lot of us have done it. Most of us have probably done that. And that's why we go back to like, what are you doing consistently? Because this up and down roller coaster, cut, bulk, cut, bulk, cut, bulk, a lot of times, how much is
Exhausting.
actually changing year after year? You typically kind of surpass that same median over and over and over. And even like my goal was always to be 225 pounds for whatever reason. That was in my head from like sophomore year in high school. I want to be 225. I ended up bulking to 227 in San Diego. It's not what I
Little chunky
Little,
boy.
little fluffy. It was a little fluffy. My goal was then to cut back down to 200. I'm like, oh, that's fine. I'll be a shredded 200. I was not a shredded 200 and I had to keep going. So I ended up cutting 50 pounds from 227 down to 177 to finally get like the turtle shell abs I
But
was
like
going for.
looking at him, you wouldn't like look at him at the higher weight and be like, "Oh, he needs to lose 50 pounds." Like it was like we we
I didn't
were
think I
not
had 50 pounds to
expecting
lose.
that.
So, I mean, the more of what I'm trying to get at is like the clients, weight loss clients will come to us, hey, I want to be this weight. And they may not even be happy at that weight. They might be happy 10 pounds before that. They might not be happy until 15 pounds after that. So this thing that's in our minds that's I'll be happy once I get to this number is so irrelevant. And nobody really realizes that until they get to that point, or they finally see that transformation before that. But once they're in the thick of it with obviously a coach, hopefully most of the time jumping and doing it with us, being able to reframe that number and understand, okay, it's not actually about this number. Maybe this is something I'd like to work towards, but I'm open to the idea that things may look entirely different from what I have in my head.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Moving on to the next question. This is
This is going to take us 6 hours to get through
yeah,
this
sorry
Q&A.
guys. I
Yeah, I
mean,
know.
not sorry though, because we're giving you a lot of quality info. All right, this is from Kylie. She said, really struggling to start counting my macros simply because it's a slippery slope for me to become too obsessed. What are the main tips you have for someone wanting to lose 10 pounds and not count their macros? And then she put like in a little star, potentially would count just protein. I think this is a common struggle. I
Mm.
think all of these are common struggles. So I guarantee you guys listening can relate. But we often hear like tracking macros is really obsessive or it makes me disordered. And I know, Joelle, you can speak to this being somebody who has gone through an actual eating disorder. So I would love for you to share your perspective here first.
Yeah, I do have, I think, an interesting perspective on this because I know that for some people, macro tracking can be too obsessive for them. Like we have clients who have had, history of eating disorders, no longer considered like active eating disorders, but they know their triggers. And for a lot of them, returning to macro tracking and being like having these perfectionist tendencies toward numbers can feel really obsessive for them. And one of the reasons we love macro tracking is because it allows for flexibility, right? So if it's having the opposite effect on someone, then we are potentially doing more harm than good. So in that sense, I agree that she shouldn't necessarily track macros if she knows that that does feel obsessive and disordered for her, because there are ways um, to diet and to achieve your goals without macro tracking. Now, that being said, my perspective is a little bit different, just in terms of my own personal experience with an eating disorder. Macro tracking for me very much helped me recover from my eating disorder. And I'm not sure that that's everyone's experience. I don't believe it's everyone's experience. But for me, at a time where macro tracking was not, this huge thing yet, and I had so many food fears. And I genuinely, I was in college. I was an 18-year-old kid Googling like how to get abs for summer and reading all sorts of things like don't eat carbs and don't eat salt and don't eat sugar and don't eat fat. And pretty much the list of bad foods in my head grew, and the list of what was good or okay to eat, that list was just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And it wasn't until I worked with someone who introduced me to the idea of calories and macro tracking. And this is probably like 2012-ish, just to kind of give a time frame. It wasn't until that time, and then I remember having a conversation with this person and him saying, "Joelle, you could eat a Pop Tart, and your Pop Tart would fit into your carbs and your fats for the day, and as long as you don't go over your calories, the Pop Tart can't make you fat." And that was like mind blowing information to me. And so that was actually what I would credit like the start of healing my relationship with food. And so, again, I know that that is not everyone's experience, but macro tracking really helped me because it showed me that I could flexibly eat the foods that I wanted without it having a direct impact on my weight.
Yeah.
So that would be my main perspective in that sense. But there are absolutely ways to go about a health and fitness goal without tracking. I know we have coaches at Levolution who really love to work with those clients specifically. Shameless plug, but like I know Coach Sarah, Coach Tori, I mean Coach Haley as well work closely with clients on different methods like the plate method or the portion method or the hand portion method. And there are a lot of different things that you could do. I do think that the willingness to track protein is something that is helpful. That's something that we've done with our clients in the past too, where it's like, okay, let's just track protein and maybe even protein and calories, and then you let carbs and fats fall where they may. I have a client who's currently doing that. Another route that I like to take, and this might not help if you're entirely unwilling to track, but another route that I like to take with clients is macro ranges. So that it kind of takes away the pressure and the overwhelm and the daunting feeling of trying to hit every macro down to the last gram. It's like, hey, let's have this 200-calorie range. Instead of saying 130 grams of protein, how about you try to land anywhere between 120 and 150? And instead of 50 grams of fat, how about you try to land anywhere between 40 and 50? Or 250 grams of carbs, let's shoot for plus or minus 20. So 230 grams of carbs all the way up to 270 grams of carbs, let's try to land in that range. And I find that takes away a lot of that pressure and obsession about having to hit numbers perfectly. So if there is some willingness to track there, which it sounds like there is some willingness to track, because she said she'd be okay with protein, that could be another strategy to explore as well.
Yeah, and I think it was Coach Haley actually who posted this on her stories yesterday. Somebody asked for like her overall like nutrition tip, and it was simply to add and not subtract. So focus on
Yes.
what you can add into your diet, like whole foods, vegetables, fruits, adding color to your plate. These are simple things that we know that yeah, you're focusing on adding, so you're probably like, well, that's how is that going to help me lose body fat? But when you add more of these whole foods, fiber, plants, it's going to just naturally kind of allow you to eat at a more baseline level, if not slightly in a deficit compared to what you may or may not have been eating before. And a lot of people, when they start to want to diet or focus on fat loss, it's always like, all right, well, what can I cut out? How many things can I take out of my diet? But if you simply make that switch mentally and focus on what you can add in, you sort of naturally just eat better quality, but also the calories come down without really thinking about it.
It's definitely a point you guys were talking about before. Every one of these questions could be its own full episode. So I'll try to cliff note this one. I personally don't love tracking macros. Like I'll use it as a tool for a period of time as I need to do it. I just started picking up tracking again because I am starting to play a little bit with eating windows and I want to make sure I'm not under eating within those time frames. I like to try different things and see how I feel as part of my healing journey and just, overall quality of life stuff. So I am playing with that and I do need to track to make sure I'm consuming, well over 3,000 calories a day because that's been my pitfall when I attempt this. That said, I went untracked for about 7 or 8 months, up until this past few weeks. And I was able to, we talked about gaintaining. That's what I was on because I don't have a huge sweet tooth. Like we'll enjoy moderation. We've got 1,000 episodes on that, but the vast majority of our diet is whole foods. And it's very, I don't want to say impossible, obviously, but it's more difficult to overeat to an extent that you normally would with highly processed foods when most of what you're consuming is whole foods, nutrient dense options. You feel good, you eat slow. We drink plenty of water, so I'm up to point with my hunger cues, and I'm even able to manipulate that to go into a slight surplus or a slight deficit by not tracking, all intuitive. That said, when we talk about utilizing counting macros as a tool, it is the most efficient way to get to a specific goal. When you're hitting targets, when you're doing that consistently, when you're seeing that return and you can actually manipulate the numbers based on what you're seeing over a period of a few weeks, you have to be much more patient and you have a lot less flexibility when you're not tracking macros. Because if you're using the plate method, if you're just eyeballing portions, if you're focusing on consuming primarily whole foods, but you're mixing things up all the time, you don't actually know what those variables are. So you aren't really sure what to change to see progress towards your goal, whether it's gaining muscle, whether it's losing fat. So there is additional flexibility that is added to the table when you do something like tracking. Like, yes, it's a little more monotonous and you can get hung up on the numbers a bit. But like you were talking about, Joel, like there's flexibility with that. Whereas if you are going with the intuitive approach, you have to kind of dumb things down unless you're just a pro's pro and you've been doing this for decades. You have to be able to simplify it to, oh, I had this thing. Now I have to manipulate this specific thing without measuring it and just looking at it.
I also just think one thing that made me think of too, Josh. Yes, I agree. Like macro tracking is a tool, and if you're a veteran, macro tracker, you might be able to figure out the calories and macros and things pretty intuitively. But two things I wanted to mention. One is your mindset going into macro tracking, because you mentioned something really important just now, Josh, tracking to make sure you're eating enough. And I think people often associate tracking with making sure they're not eating too much. And then coming into tracking, it can feel restrictive right off the bat. Whereas if you kind of had that mindset shift of, and maybe even if it's in a deficit, maybe the thought process is like, maybe you're just not talking about it in a sense like, yeah, macro tracking keeps me from overeating or like keeps me from binging. Instead of it's like, yeah, I'm tracking because I want to make sure I'm fueling my body with all the right nutrients, or I want to make sure that I'm fueling my body so that I can perform in the gym well and recover from my training sessions well. I think that even just that mindset shift of how and why you're tracking can be helpful. And then the one other thing that I just wanted to mention is for this person, I think you said Kylie Alessandra. Um, if she doesn't want to track religiously, it could still be helpful to at least for a few days track what she is currently eating. And we have all clients do this when they come to us. In their questionnaire, it says, hey, we need you to track for a few days just so we can see inputs of how much you're currently eating, like without trying to hit any specific numbers, trying to be as honest with yourself and with your coach as possible. Track for a few days just to see where things land. But then at least if you have a baseline of how you've typically been eating on average or how much you've typically been eating on average, then I think once you at least have that baseline in a sense, now if you want to step away from tracking, you at least have that baseline of like, okay, so I could see I'm probably not getting enough protein based on these numbers. I could see I'm probably getting way too many dietary fats and I'm not getting enough fiber. And so if you have that prior tracking experience or that prior nutrition education where you know what foods to get fiber from, what foods to get protein from, and how to decrease fats in your diet, now that you've had that baseline, you could carry on with a non-tracking route with a little bit more accuracy. So I would say at minimum, track for a few days to kind of see where you're currently at and then adjust from there.
I want to take a very quick side tangent, just because people might be listening to this and saying, oh, now I kind of want to try to not track. So to reverse engineer that, what we've had clients do, if you are tracking now and you want to scale back from tracking, is take away a tracking day per week. So literally what you were just talking about for the baseline, Joel. And this is just to make sure like, hey, on this period of time where I haven't been tracking, am I still aligned with where I think I am? Because you start to drift. So week 1, you track every day. Week 2, you're going to track 6 days. Week 3, you're going to track 5 days and keep pulling a day out. So you're kind of getting used to going through the routine, but you see that the numbers are falling in. And then once you're done tracking for a while, maybe it's once every few weeks, jump in, track a day and see how far you've drifted from that baseline.
So as you guys can see, there are a lot of options and things here when it comes to tracking macros, and it's not as straightforward or black and white as tracking and not tracking. Like there is such a range of approaches you can take, and honestly, I'm sure all of our clients approach this slightly different. There's probably
Yeah.
some, overlap, but I think that's the biggest take home is that it's not just tracking macros. Maybe it's the way that you were doing it before that didn't work for you. So love that. All right. Ellie said, how do you navigate wanting to gain muscle and achieve fat loss with injuries like a lower back, disc issues, restricting lower body exercises? Similar being postpartum, how does one tackle wanting to lift weights or run, but being restricted, having a prolapse, accounting for pelvic floor PT taking place? Thank you for doing what you guys do. So 2 questions there. The first one, again, another common misconception I think a lot of people have is that once they're injured, they can't do anything when it comes to exercise. And I think we have 2 really amazing athletic trainers at Levolution who work with a lot of our clients who do have injuries. And the biggest piece of take home advice there that I can give you is that there is still so much you can do no matter what your
Yes.
injury is. And it just comes down to the right programming and being able to work around your individual injury.
People really overestimate the amount of variety you need to see progress.
Mm,
You can stick to the basics. Like if you have four movements, three movements that you can do for
yeah.
lower body, whatever it is, and you're focusing on progressing those week over week, you're going to see progress. You're going to improve your body composition over time. So whatever it is that you have been deemed that has been deemed safe for you to perform around that injury, focus on those. Don't worry about changing things up every 4 weeks. Like stick with those, change the reps, change the stimulus slightly without changing the movement. Even if you change the angle a little bit, goes a long way. But focus on the basics that you can perform and get better at them over time.
Amen. And then to touch
Amen.
on the postpartum side of that question, I think prolapse is obviously something many women deal with being postpartum. And from obviously, this is slightly outside of my scope as far as what I can recommend. But, I think your question was like, how do you tackle wanting to lift weights or run, but being restricted? I don't know if you follow it's Dr. Jen, but it's not the Dr. Jen that I worked with for the ebook. I'm blanking on her Instagram name now, but she talks a lot about prolapse. And I think one of the take home messages I've gotten from her is that prolapse, you can still do things while you are experiencing prolapse. And for some people, that prolapse never goes away. So are you just never going to exercise again? No, probably not. It's finding what you're able to do and what does feel good. So,
Yeah.
kind of the same thing as the injury question. It's like you have to find the workarounds. And while you're managing that with the right person, a pelvic floor PT, there is things that you can do. And it's not like you just have to just sit there and do nothing and wait for it to go away.
And also props to that person for being in pelvic floor PT because I think
Yeah.
so many women just accept that that has to be their new norm, and there is a lot that people could do for symptom management.
Hmm.
But I also think that I liked what you said, Alessandra, about making sure that you are focusing on what you can do. You both mentioned this, but focusing on what you can do and not on what you can't do and what you're limited with. And also talk to your pelvic floor PT about what they think might be, quote, safer exercises for you to do. Um, but you're gonna know your body best. Like you're gonna know when you feel those prolapse symptoms, and maybe you can run, but you can't run 7 miles. You start to notice symptoms after 2 miles. And so cool, do the 2 mile run. So part of that is gonna come with just time and experience and trial and error about what feels good and what doesn't. And hopefully those symptoms will improve with time. Um, or Alessandra, were you thinking of 2P's Wellness? Is that her?
No,
A
I'm gonna look
different
her up
Jen?
because
There's
I
a few
want
different.
to shout her out.
There are several different Dr. Jens, and I swear they're all pelvic floor PTs.
It's so true. Doc Jen Fitness. I don't know why I was blanking
Okay,
on
I
that.
think I follow her too.
Um, Jen Ryan is her name. She's great. She really just posts a lot of like the no BS. Like she doesn't make it about fear when it comes to pelvic floor issues or
Hmm.
any of that. So go ahead and follow her, guys. I'll try to remind Josh to link her in the show notes too. But she has some really great content surrounding prolapse and just a lot of those typical symptoms you see postpartum. All right. Next question is from Jen. Speaking of
Doc
Jens,
Jen,
benefits to warming up, static versus dynamic warm up. How long should a warm up be? Thank you.
don't look at
Short.
me.
Why? You're not the king of warm
I'm
ups.
not the king of
Josh
warm-ups.
never
I'm
warms up.
I'm the
I'm
king of
not the king of
efficiency.
warm ups either. Of the three of us, Alessandra's probably the one that does the most warming up and mobility work and all of that. I'm a hop on the treadmill for 10 minutes kind of gal.
Which is
And
fine. I think
yeah,
that's perfectly fine.
I'm a stretch a frozen rubber band kind of guy.
Yeah, Josh is not your warm up guy. But, there obviously it depends on what you're talking about here. So if you're warming up for a run is very different than warming up for a strength
yeah,
workout. So yeah, I do tend to lean towards getting my mobility work and doing more of like a dynamic, flowy type of warm up. And if you follow the build or move programs in the app, you know this. It's included in those programs, and it's not anything extensive either. It's 8 minutes. It's literally 2 rounds of 4-minute exercises. And I just do that I just enjoy that more. I feel better doing that than walking on the treadmill, but there has been phases of my life where I'll hop on the treadmill or the bike and just literally focus on getting my body warm. Like I think at the end of the day, that's probably the most important thing when it comes to both strength and cardio. Um, and as far as running goes, you might need to do a little bit more of like the plyos and just things to get your body ready to actually run. But even then, it doesn't have to be this like dragged out 20-minute thing because I know most of you just don't have the time to do that or want to do that. So I think both a dynamic warm up is great. The only thing I would advise you not to do is static stretching beforehand. We know static stretching before strength work is not the best.
Well, what would you say for someone like myself? And this isn't something I typically do, but the idea that you don't want to overstretch, you lose that overlap. But for someone who's all bunched up like this, would there be any benefit to stretching pre-lift to just get to this point?
Static
Only
stretching?
Yeah.
only after you're warmed up.
Yeah.
Like
Okay.
you don't want to go into a static stretch cold.
Right. The frozen
So
over
if
thing.
you were to warm up on a treadmill first and then do a little bit of static stretching, that would be better. But ultimately, like A, you don't want to stretch cold muscles, but B, static stretching just hasn't been shown to be very helpful
Why
or
not just do a
beneficial.
dynamic stretching though? Is my
I'm not
question.
actually asking for me. I was just thinking for the guy in my situation.
I would recommend the guy in your situation to do a dynamic warm up if he wants to improve his mobility and touch his toes.
That's never going to happen for me. I'm asking for the audience. I will never be able to touch my toes.
The
I
mindset
also want to
be like
point out that when you hear the words warm up, the point of the warm up is actually to increase your core temperature. Like
Mhm.
it's not to like warm up the muscles, well, in a sense, but the point is actually to increase your core temperature and then start moving the muscles. So
For me,
I
that's
am
standing in front of the propane heater while it blasts on my face
I
until
mean,
I jump into my first set.
maybe a warm up is sitting in the sauna for a few minutes
Yeah,
pre-workout.
that too. But also to this point, we do all do warm up sets for our lifts as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when you're doing like the bigger compound lifts, especially, you do want to make sure you're not just hopping up to your working weight. And I guarantee you, most of you are not going to be able to hop up to your working weight. If I'm
Yeah.
squatting for like this program of build, we have a couple sets of 3 reps. I'm not going to walk into the gym and just throw 225 on the bar and just start squatting. Like, no, I need to work my way up there. So warm up sets are also super important when it comes to like the strength side of
I think
things.
Dr. Mike Yurzatel, I don't know if he was doing this for a while or if this is just something he was playing with, but he would actually his last warm-up set was actually heavier than his first working set to kind of get his nervous system adapted to
I can see
that and then
that.
scale it back. Like
Interesting.
not going to significant fatigue, but feeling that weight, letting
Yeah.
your nervous system adapt to that, and then coming down to your first working set.
As a ex powerlifter, that makes sense in my mind because I can tell you there's been plenty of times where you like get to your working sets and you don't really feel good until you get to like your second or
Yeah.
third or fourth set. Like if I was doing a 5x3 of squats, I remember often like they wouldn't feel good till the last couple of sets. So I could see that like playing a big role depending on what your goal is, of course.
Can I also just go off on a side tangent? Still related, I promise. But about working sets versus warm-up sets, because
Yes.
this is something that I notice with clients, and I'm sure this happens with app members, and I know many of y'all listening are app members, so I want to bring this up. Don't you be logging your warm-up sets as your working sets in the app or in your workouts in the portal or whatever, if you're a client or whatever. I'm going to give you an example because this is something that I see all the time. Let's say you're warming up and you're doing sets of squats, right? We'll just go with Alessandra's example of like throwing 225 on the bar. Okay. If you are doing 95 pounds first set, 135 pounds second set, third set comes, you throw 225 on the bar. That is not your 3 sets.
Mm-mm.
2 of those were your working sets. And I will see people
Warm-up
log
sets.
those
Two of those
first
were your
2.
warm-up sets.
What's that?
Warm-up sets. The first 2 were your warm-up sets. You said working.
Oh, sorry. Yes. The first 2 were your warm up sets. If that third one where you're doing 225 is your like, okay, that's where I'm going to be. Like that's top weight for me now. That was your first working set. So the
Mhm.
95 and the 135, those were warm up sets. Don't be logging those as your as your working sets.
You're leaving
Um,
gains on the table if you're doing that.
yes,
Pay
leaving
attention
the
to the
gains.
RPE or the RIR or whatever the intensity metric is. Pay attention to that for all your sets, your
Yep,
actual sets.
that's it. That's my side note.
I
It's my
love
side
it.
tangent.
Important things. All right. Caitlin says struggling coming out of a dieting phase and seeing the scale go back up a little bit. Also, would love a little more advice on how to break from tracking macros and transition into intuitive eating without going overboard. Starting our next IVF transfer cycle in a couple weeks, and I realistically know this is the best thing to do for this season of life, but mentally it's harder than anticipated. So back to the first question, she was asking, she's struggling coming out of her dieting phase and seeing the scale go up. Common client fear slash struggle. And it kind of goes back to what we talked about, I think, in the first question, where your scale weight is a range. It's not going to be the same thing all the time. And I think it is sort of just a mindset thing when you're used to seeing it go down in a dieting phase and then it stops going down. It's like, oh, but that's not the phase of dieting that you're in anymore. So you have to be in the phase that you're in.
Well, it's also what's your offboarding plan? Like, did you just go from 1200 back to 2000? Like, did
True.
you jump back to previous maintenance or did you come out of that a little bit differently?
True. That all definitely depends. Joelle, were you going to pop in with something?
Yeah, this I know this person's name, and they're a level 10 client, well, a Levolution client,
Watch your
but
mouth.
a previous level 10 client. And for well, let me start here. One, this also comes back to the conversation about maintenance. Your weight likely is going to look different at maintenance than it did in a deficit. And to Alessandra's point, you might have that bouncing of the scale weight a little bit, but you're probably talking about like a 2 to 3 pound fluctuation max. If weight continues to climb from there, and increasing week after week after week, you're not at maintenance. You're in a surplus. And so those calories would potentially need to be tapered back to a more modest maintenance level. So again, remember that maintenance is that range. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing, and I happen to know this person's coach was Coach Sarah previously. And Coach Sarah wrote a great email that will probably go up onto the blog eventually about transitioning away from macro tracking. And there's a lot of really great tips in there about different approaches. And some of this we kind of talked about in that first question about doing a calorie range and taking a more flexible approach with calorie tracking or macro tracking and having those broad ranges. Josh, you also mentioned a great strategy about like weaning off of tracking days. If you take someone who is tracking 7 days a week, maybe start by removing 2 non-consecutive days of tracking, and still pay attention to your weight and your hunger and your fullness and your digestion and your energy and your performance and your sleep and all of those different measures of biofeedback. Try to eat the same way that you would if you were tracking. And then over time, like remove 1 or 2 days, and slowly building up to that full week. Knowing that you've worked with Sarah in the past, I'm sure she's talked a lot about like hunger and fullness awareness. And I think that those are also super important to keep in mind when you leave macro tracking. It's actually one thing I don't love about tracking macros, is that I think sometimes it can teach you to sort of ignore your hunger and satiety cues because you're eating for the sake of I got to make sure I hit these numbers, as opposed to like what am I actually hungry right now, or like am I eating this because I have to hit my protein. Always a time and a place, but kind of getting back in touch with those hunger and satiety cues I also think is going to be really helpful coming out of that macro tracking season. And then you could always use things like the hand size portions or the plate method, which are essentially just ways to sort of loosely estimate the macro components of foods without having to use a scale or a food app.
Just to clarify, the plate method is as long as it fits on my plate, it counts as a meal, correct? If I can balance it properly.
Not quite sure about that.
All right. Next question is from Lucy. She said, advice for sticking to a program when you're moving like out of your house and you haven't decided whether you'll join a gym or work out at home. I'd say do what you can with what you have right now. So if you're in between places and working out at home is kind of just easier to commit to, then focus on that and maybe in a month or two, when you're settled, you do start to go to a gym again and you can pick back up a gym program. But it's not a bad thing to like it. I know you do use the app, Lucy. So like if you need to swap, I mean, build and move can be done at home or at the gym, but like just swap out some movements that you don't have equipment for and you're still going to make progress. It's not something where it's like you're doomed if you're going to work out home with just a set of dumbbells for a month when I know you've been
Yeah.
lifting consistently for years. Like that's you're going to be okay.
And as long as you have the knowledge to make those substitutions, like I would tell, clients previously, or like we had a training subscription, and sometimes you'd get someone who, like, you have a home version and a gym version, and they're like, well, I have a home gym and I have dumbbells and I have barbells, but I don't have cables and I don't have machines. Like, which one should I do? And I always tell people to err toward the home version, because there's a dumbbell substitution for everything, right? If there's a cable machine, there's a dumbbell substitution for it. If something says barbell, there's a dumbbell substitution for it. If something's a machine, there's usually a barbell or dumbbell substitution for it. So I tend to tell people err on the side of home workouts in terms of program options. And then if you go to a gym and you want to introduce a machine instead, then swap out one of those exercises.
Yeah, it's obviously cycles of life, different phases of life. So you don't have to PRs every single week while you're going through this move. Focus on doing what you can. You're going to maintain where you're at just fine. And then as things settle down, you can get back to the nitty gritty.
All right, Sarah said, advice or thoughts for cutting through the noise of the information overload with functional slash holistic
Mm.
medicine. It interests me to know more, but I feel like I've fallen too deep down the rabbit hole. Now I'm overwhelmed with all of that info and I feel analysis paralysis and I'm stressing myself out that I'm never making the right choices for myself and my family. I'm on the verge of just unfollowing all these types of accounts and just going with my gut instinct. I'm an accountant, no science background. It's hard for me to know who to believe because I don't have the knowledge myself. However, I'm the stereotypical accountant who is type A and wants a clear answer for every decision I make. Would love to hear your
Just
perspectives.
listen to this podcast and shut everyone else out.
I actually have so many thoughts here, and I find this so relatable. Um, Personally, I went through a very, like, very, very into functional health phase of life. When I was diagnosed with PCOS, I was missing menstrual cycles. I was having a hard time with getting a cycle back and having a period, and wanted to get pregnant, but didn't have a period, and blah, 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 blah. And personally, in that scenario, I was not getting the answers that I wanted from conventional medicine. I was seeing OBs and reproductive endocrinologists, and everyone was just like, yeah, I mean, the treatment for PCOS is to go on birth control. And I'm like, but I'm trying to get pregnant. Like, why would I go back on birth control? Anyway, this is a whole podcast for another time. Um, but that's when I started to seek out the more functional realm of health. And there were a lot of changes that I made that, and Josh, you and I chatted about this a little bit the other day with the Barrett's esophagus stuff, about like the things you did then, you're not necessarily doing now. There's principles and practices that you took away from that time period, but you're not maybe doing all of those things right now because different seasons of life call for different, like, measures of restrictiveness or leniency and whatnot. So my first follow-up question to the person who initially asked this question is, do you have a reason that you are specifically looking to the functional health route? Because I think if you aren't in a situation where you are not getting the answers you want in conventional medicine, you, let's say, feel terrible, but all of your conventional labs look fine, like, that's what I'm saying is, like, okay, that might be worth exploring the more functional side of things. I think for the average person who's just trying to, like, improve their overall health, eat some more color, get some more movement in, you probably don't need to go down into those deep dive rabbit holes of functional health and functional nutrition.
Because it's true, it is super overwhelming. Like you go on social media and there's posts about this and that and the fear mongering and all of the things, and you can get sucked in really easily. But all of that has to come and start with the basics. You have to build the foundation, all the things we talk about here on the podcast with the L5 method and the 5 pillars, like that is step one. And then if you're not in a good place, even doing those things, then yeah, maybe something else is going on that you need to dive into deeper. But ultimately, across the board, I agree with you, Joelle, that for you and your family, like just do the basic things and don't get too obsessive with it, because then that can also just that impacts your mental health negatively.
And that's the point of the L5 method. It's to simplify the things that work, the basics that are going to make the biggest difference. Those are your pillars, those are your building blocks. Training, nutrition, mindset, movement, habits. You pick a couple things, you pick one thing for each of those and you stick with it. If it's working great, keep with it. If you feel like something's off, then manipulate it a little bit. But don't worry about going down a rabbit hole for every single thing when we're focusing on, general health and optimizing our life. But if it is a situation where there are things going on and you're juggling, you're battling between traditional medicine and taking that holistic approach, Joel, like you kind of hit on, the answers aren't always, I don't want to say what we want to hear because rarely are answers what we want to hear, but going back to Barrett's esophagus, I was told after my diagnosis that there's nothing I could do to heal. It was specifically management to not get esophageal cancer. Here I am about 12 years later. I did go through a series of radio frequency ablations where they burned my throat with a laser, 7 surgeries over 14 months. But I've been off medication for over 5 years, strictly by lifestyle management, by the things that I choose to put and not put into my body and the way I live my life. Medication free, I'm still clear. And it's been something they have advised against every step of the way. And I battled them from the beginning because I knew that wasn't something I
Yeah.
wanted to be on long term. There are things with PPIs that you have to look out for as far as your health and side effects. And I didn't accept that answer. So there are helpful routes you can take when you're talking about going down that rabbit hole in the holistic approach. I would say definitely look for maybe an in-person practitioner who does align with those things. So you have someone kind of going along with you. I've gone down the naturopath route. Obviously, in this field, I've been able to do a little more digging myself, which is where a lot of this stuff has come from as far as my personal protocols. But for the average person, find a practitioner who is aligned with what your goals are. And I know how difficult that can be. So just
Feels impossible.
don't give up
Mhm.
on it. They are out there. Maybe they're telehealth, but they do exist, especially with the way things are turning now and the awareness of how things have been. They should coexist. Traditional medicine and the holistic approach, they should
Yeah.
coexist. And we should now understand common sense tells us by doing things the right way, those two things can work harmoniously together.
I would also like to say that some of those practitioners exist at Levolution,
This is true.
not functional doctors, but we have 2 coaches on staff who very much work on the functional integrative nutrition health side of things. Our registered dietitian Ariana, she's awesome. She does a lot of work with our Hashimoto's, autoimmune, PCOS, like hormone dysfunction, because registered dietitians are who can technically provide medical nutrition therapy, and work with, more of that like dysfunction populate, not that the people are dysfunctional, but like hormone dysfunction or gut dysbiosis, things like that. Ari works really closely with those clients as well as Coach Courtney. They are our 2 coaches who, when we get an application and someone's got like IBS or Crohn's or Hashimoto's or some other autoimmune disease, or PCOS or missing cycles, like they go with those coaches because those coaches are our coaches who are fitness and nutrition, but they really do take a functional approach. You can get lab testing through them as well. And so we do have some of those practitioners in some capacity within scope
Yep.
at Levolution.
We have Kara as well, another RD who does work with treating specific
Oh yeah,
things through food.
yeah, yeah.
All right, so we have 5 more, so let's get them in.
All
Trisha
right.
said slowing down running in the colder months due to live kids, the dark. Understandable. Will that really hinder my progress? So if you're slowing down running, but you're still doing some type of cardio, you're still going to maintain your cardiovascular endurance. That's what I would recommend. If you're slowing down running and not replacing that with anything else, then that's unfortunately how the cookie
Yeah, you're gonna
crumbles, is
lose
you're going to
some.
lose your progress. So it depends, but I think a lot of people kind of gravitate towards either hopping on the treadmill, which I know is not everybody's favorite, or doing some other type of cross training in the winter and then coming back out in the spring after your hibernation. Because it's really hard to wake up early at 4:35 and go outside and run, especially when there's snow and ice on the ground if you live
It's
somewhere that
dark.
has that and it's so dark. So I don't blame you, Trisha. But yeah, I would say just try to replace it with some other type of cardio. I've been loving the Peloton again now that Josh reactivated my membership.
I deactivated because it was not
Yay.
touched for 6 months.
Because I was running. I
I
was
enjoy
running.
I enjoy the Just Ride. I don't need membership for that.
Now we
Princess
can
over
ride
here.
I
together.
like
Princess over
but
here.
I like the classes. Tell him that I'm not
It's so
crazy for
All
nice.
right, come on.
liking.
We
No.
got to rapid fire these last five here.
All right.
Okay, fine.
Patient
No more
said,
tangents.
currently have my macros set in a cut phase. I've joined the app. I'm doing build and the begin run walk program. I've lost a little over 40 pounds this year. Go
Congrats.
you.
Well done.
But I've
Yeah.
decided to switch up my programming because I really wanted to give your app a try. I'm loving it in all caps, just for a little emphasis there so far. And I'm wondering if you have any additional advice for me going forward. I still have about 40 pounds I would like to lose. Thanks for your time. First, congrats. Like losing 40 pounds
No small feat.
is huge. I would say the biggest thing is make sure that, and I'm sure Joelle, you'll agree with me, if you have been in a deficit for basically the whole year so far, we do want to take some time in maintenance. And hopefully, you have learned a little bit more about maintenance from the first few questions. But it kind of depends. I mean, it depends on how adherent you've been to that cut phase, how long the cut phase has been, what life has looked like. Has it been super consistent for the whole year where you've been in a true deficit, or have you been kind of like going in and out of the deficit? Like all of these things matter. So we kind of need some follow-up answers there to answer accurately. But I would say I just want to make the point that oftentimes we're not going to lose all of the weight that we want to lose in one cut phase. Do you agree?
Me? Are you
Yeah.
asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I also want to call attention to biofeedback, because if this is, at first glance when I read the question, and I just had it up in front of me and now I just lost it again. But um at first glance, when I had read the question, it said, like, I'm down 40 pounds. I've switched up my programming. I want to lose another 40 pounds. What do you recommend? My first response is keep doing what you're doing. You lost 40 pounds doing what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing. The fact that you've changed your programming and now you're in the app and all of that, that's not going to change your weight loss outcomes. If you were strength
Mhm.
training 4 days a week and now you're strength training with a different program 4 days a week or however many days a week, whatever you're doing, that's not going to negatively impact your weight loss. So if you are doing what you're doing and you feel good and you have good energy and your digestion is good and your sleep is good and you're managing your stress well and you don't feel like you're eating 400 calories a day, assuming that's not happening and that generally speaking biofeedback is good, so sleep, digestion, and hunger levels and recovery and soreness and things like that, assuming all of that is fine, keep doing what you're doing. Get on with your bad self. However, to Alessandra's point, if biofeedback is suffering, if you are starving, if you are not recovering well from your workouts, if you have this lingering soreness, if your digestion is not great, your sleep is not great, it might be time for a diet break, a maintenance phase. And then you can always revisit that deficit later. So a little bit more context is needed there, but hopefully that's helpful.
All right, Alicia said, my husband has been training consistently nearly every morning since April and feels like he is not gaining muscle while doing what we feel are a lot of the right things. I cook all of our meals at home, always a protein-focused meal, mostly whole foods. He eats a banana before his workout and drinks a protein shake with creatine every morning after. He works a mostly sedentary office job, but always gets out for a short walk at lunchtime. He's 6'1", around 175, 180, and has always been a thinner build, hard gainer. His programming he was following was a CrossFit style workout, a lift about 3 times a week with a workout after, and then the other 2 days just the workout without the major lift beforehand. These have lots of lifting and body weight in them, but are also very much cardio. The things he feels like he is not doing well is getting enough sleep. We get to bed later with two little boys who go down at night, and he's up early to work out. And he doesn't eat a breakfast meal in the morning, just the pre and post workout fuel. He hasn't tracked food in a couple years, so not sure where he's at for calories, but he just tries to eat as much as he can. He has just switched to a more traditional bodybuilding style workout to pull back on the cardio to see if that helps. What would your other recommendations be for him to start seeing more muscle gain?
Yeah, definitely
Eat
start with the
more.
sleep. Eat more is a
Eat
huge
more.
component there.
Before
He's
she even
not
got
eating
to the end
enough.
of that about calories, I was like, eat more.
Yep,
You've
same.
Well,
got
she
to eat
mentioned the
more.
banana pre-workout. It sounds like that probably counts as a meal. He's not eating breakfast. He's under eating.
Right.
Hard gainer just means you're not consuming enough calories. Like that's
Yeah.
at the end of the day that your caloric threshold is too low.
Yep.
Focus on sleep. That's gonna help with recovery. It's gonna help with optimizing hormone levels. And then a good switch was jumping off CrossFit into
Yeah, I
traditional
was gonna say
bodybuilding.
that was probably holding him back
Body
before he
weight
went
movements
CrossFit.
to kind of scale back to how do we actually see progress, performance, and muscle. It's 1 to 4 reps short of true failure, absolute failure, and really it's closer to 1 to 2 reps of short of absolute failure. So if you're doing body weight squats for 45 seconds, your legs are burning, but you could probably theoretically do another 100 reps before you're even close to that. So it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to get to 1 to 4 or 1 to 2 with a body weight movement. So jumping out of the CrossFit realm and coming back into bodybuilding where you're actually using weights that are challenging much sooner. It's also much better for recovery when it comes to getting that close to failure. Like higher reps, getting to that range of intensity has a much higher amount of fatigue that's accumulating over time versus doing 6 to 12 reps of a heavier weight. Even I'd even cut that down to 8 to 10. So 4 to 8, for example, will be a great range to get to that 1 to 2 reps short of true failure for each set. So those are some, if he focused on those three things, eating more, sleeping as well as he can. I know that's tough with kids. And then getting to that level of intensity with a traditional bodybuilding split, those things are going to change the game.
Two more. Natalie said, question about time of day training. 5 a.m. I've eaten some carbs for energy before training, like a kid's pouch or a banana and peanut butter. My max lifts for back squat, for example, are always 15 to 20 pounds less than if I train mid-morning, midday. Is there something I can do to change this or just lift less those mornings and swallow my pride? LOL. I think this is common. I mean, it makes sense, right? When you're lifting later in the day, you have more food in you, you have more energy. Therefore, you probably are just more awake and alive and your body is ready to go. So I can relate to that.
Same.
You can try eating more before your workout. I know that's not always possible when you're training at 5 a.m., but even if you get like a Gatorade down, like something easy that's easy to digest, that's quick carbs, that might be helpful. You have any other tips for her?
I would just say like, and I know it's tough if your schedule changes and there's certain days you can do certain things, but I would commit to one time period. Like if you can always commit to the early workouts, stick with that. Because this way it's not like you're bouncing up and down with weight. This is the consistent stimulus. Like this is the time that I train. This is how difficult it is at that time of day. And now I'm
Yeah.
not gonna shake things up and do it, at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday. It's always gonna be 5 o'clock in the morning. So it won't be I lose 15 pounds. It's just this is my weight. This is my stimulus for this period that I'm now going to train regularly.
On the flip side of that, if you are not going or if you can't train regularly at that time every week, just know that, like, understand that that's just how the cookie's crumbling. And you don't have to compare last week to this week if it was at a completely different time. Like, yeah, that's going to be a difference in what your squat was. But if you know that going into it, just embracing that with the right mindset might be helpful
Something
too.
is better than nothing.
I think you could also just real quick, I think you could also play around with dinner time. I don't know what your nighttime, like last meal of the day looks like, which is technically going to be your last meal before that lift. But making sure that you're having enough carbs at that dinner time meal as well to
Hmm.
help kind of prep you and glycogen stores for the morning workout.
Love it. All right. Steph has the last question of the day. Should we incorporate a cool down into our strength training? We'll start there because she has a few questions. So let's answer that one first. Do we need a cool down for strength training? I say
No,
no. Cool down
no.
is really just specifically for cardio purposes. Like if you're out for a run, you want to make sure you slowly let your heart rate come down and do that cool down. With strength training, our goal is not to get our heart rate up and keep it up the entire time. Like it should be coming down in between sets already. So you don't need like to stretch or do a cool down unless you want to do a stretch and static stretch
So
afterward.
there has been some stuff like if you do some box breathing afterwards, it can help with recovery, and that can obviously bring the heart rate down too.
Yeah.
Not needed, but Dr. Andy Galpin had some stuff on that.
How many times per week should we do a Metcon?
You don't. So was this specifically like how many you need to do in the app? Like they're there.
No, she
There
just
was, I think there's one on your original post. You don't need to do the Metcons. Like the Metcons are fun ways to mix it up, spike your heart rate. Like that's just something that's in the app, especially if you don't want to get outside right now and you
it's
want to
just
do
a
some
type
hit.
of
Yeah.
cardio.
If you want to do some hit instead of riding a bike or going for a run out in the cold. So there's no specific metric. I think if you want to go back to the guidelines on the weekly basis, you want to hit them with the ACSM,
Sorry, I was
cardio
half
queen.
listening because I was reading the next
Vigorous
question.
I was
exercise
reading the next
versus
question
moderate.
too.
Vigorous versus moderate
Oh yeah.
activity guidelines.
So for moderate exercise, or the ACSM has exercise recommendations. So for moderate intensity exercise, I believe it's 5 times a week for at least 30 minutes. I want to say, or I'm getting them confused now. My brain is like fried. Vigorous, think more like hit style. Your heart rate is up higher, you're coming up and down. That is, you can do that less often. So 3 times a week for at least 20 minutes.
So 75 versus 150.
Right. And this kind
Yep.
of leads into her next question. What are your thoughts on cardio? For a while, it seemed like every expert on Instagram suggested walking and lifting only, no running, biking, etc. for general physical fitness. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. Thoughts, recommendations on how to start adding cardio. She's currently doing builds. I think Steph is new to like following us and she's new to the app. So we have
They
talked
were
about this
wrong,
a lot.
Steph.
They're
They were
wrong.
wrong.
But yeah, we talked about this semi recently, how the fitness industry likes to go through cycles. So for a while,
Extreme.
it was popular to just lift as heavy as possible, be a bro bodybuilder, not do any cardio, blah blah blah, and then it now it's running is having its moment, all the endurance stuff is coming back
Hybrid.
around,
Mhm.
hybrid is having its moment. You need both. You need strength training, you need cardio for
Yes.
heart health, for longevity, for overall health. That's our stance on it. What types of cardio you do or how often kind of depends on where you're at, what your goals are. So obviously we just listed the guidelines recommended by ACSM, but start where you are. So if you're not doing any cardio right now, start with 1 to 2 times per week. Any method that you enjoy. It doesn't have to be a bike or the Peloton. It doesn't have to be running. It doesn't have to be the Stairmaster, or it can be all those things. So do a
Could
method
be a
that
freaking
you
Zumba class. Have at it.
Zumba
Could be
class.
a
Yeah,
dance class. Could be a Zumba
literally
class. It
anything.
does not matter as
Yep.
long as you are getting your heart rate up continuously for a period of time. And ideally, you're doing something you enjoy because that's what you're going to stick with and be
Yep.
consistent with.
One of the things that's helped me shift my mindset in this, as far as like, what do you need? And this is during some of the darker days that our country has seen. I ask myself, what would I need to survive an apocalypse? Like, what kind of training? Like, how strong? How far can I run? How fast can I run?
Answer.
So we have the apocalypse protocol. That's our habits. But the idea is that you become a little more self-sufficient. You can take care of yourself. And that's like, okay, if I'm lifting all the time, but I can't go run 3 miles, like 3 miles isn't short, but it's really not that far. Can I go on a hike? I used to get these crazy leg cramps. We almost died on a mountain hiking Franconia Notch
There's a
because in
video
the
on
middle of like a
YouTube.
hurricane. It was insane. My legs stopped working. I'm like, I don't ever want that to happen again. So just functionally, what do I need to improve to be able to survive on my own? So little mindset shift as far as like, what do you
This
need? Ask yourself that question.
this might be my like postpartum intrusive thoughts talking, but I also think about like this is where it's about to get dark. I'm sorry. I think about all the awful things that could happen, mainly to my children. Like if someone tried, my battery in my camera just died.
That's okay.
Sorry.
I'm assuming one of these died too.
What?
I'm assuming one of these probably died too. That's what I was
Yeah.
thinking.
Okay.
Jump on it quick.
Solid. Okay. I was just gonna say, I think about sadly all of the like awful things. If you have postpartum intrusive thoughts, but all the awful things that could happen to your children. I'm like, if someone kidnapped my kids, how fast could I run to like catch them? If someone tried to yank my daughter out of my arms, how strong would I have to be to take on this 250-pound male and take my kid back? Maybe that's a little extreme, but
No, I think that's just
you go
being a
for the
parent.
apocalypse, zombie apocalypse, Josh. I go for
Not
the
zombie. There's no zombies, but like when the world ends and these people are all Chaotic.
I associate all apocalypses with The Walking Dead.
See, I
That
never
is what
watched
I
that show.
see
Yeah,
when I
Never
me
see
watched it.
too.
Never got into it.
apocalypse.
We missed, there
That's
were
a good
two more
one.
questions on mine that we will have to get to
We'll
next
jump
week, you
into them.
guys.
I do
Yeah.
want to say, because now that we're going through this whole tangent, the shirts I wanted to make we'll probably throw back up now that we're going to switch some stuff up with apparel. But lift heavy, run far, punch hard, love harder. Those were shirts we were going to make,
What
but
do you
that kind of
think, Joelle?
encapsulates that pretty well.
I'm into it.
Okay.
All right.
If you want the shirts, let Josh know. But we're gonna stop it here. This was a long but great in-depth
Yeah.
podcast.
Hopefully
So,
half of this is still on YouTube. I think everyone's camera died.
but thank you guys for tuning in.